All right, we'll get started now.
You say, what was the combination? Like when you left your quarters for the last time and you opened up your safe, what was the combination?
Get a light, will you, people? I mean, for crying out loud, it's just a TV show. I mean, look at you. Look at the way you're dressed. You've turned an enjoyable little job that I did as a lark for a few years into a colossal waste of time.
Hello, Uxbridge. How are you? Great, or as I should say, as Bob would say, splenmatma wernov vo. You got it. Great. You know, it's wonderful to be here among so many familiar faces. In fact, bang goes my speech. You guys all heard it last year.
Hi there. Yes, it's £5 for a pre-signed photograph and £10 if I sign it in front of you. And for another £10, I'll take my top off.
Hey, Skylar. Go in here. Hi, honey. What can I sign for you? Oh, no, that's okay, ma'am. I'll just go ahead and wait for curvation. Well, you're looking at her. Astro Blasto. Shh. Your curvation? I'm guessing you're not a fan of the show because that picture was taken from the first season 25 years ago. Oh, so that was you then, and this is you now. You were expecting your dream girl, right?
So, are you boys gonna block my booth all day, or are we gonna do business?
Well, I don't know. Spork, is there anything we need?
Our reserve power is running low. The warp reactor could use a new bilithium crystal.
Bicentennial crystal. Okay, you want her NRFB or MNB?
What?
NRFB. Never removed from box. MNB, mint condition, no box.
If the containment field has been tampered with, the crystal would become contaminated.
I've got to revive her.
You ruined the collector's value. Never removed from box.
NRFB! NRFB!
By Grabthar's hammer, by the sons of Warvan, I shall avenge you. By Grabthar. Next.
Whole tribe of people who prefer to interact as furry animals rather than human beings. It's instinctual. Many Native American tribes wore entire bear skins, including the head, when they performed their war dances. They thought it made them brave.
Be patient, the light will turn green momentarily.
Jesus, I'm getting really scared. I hate to say I told you so. Okay, here's the part where I give the two of you your assignments for today. Assignments? Assignments. Here are your shopping lists. When we get in there, we're gonna split up. Then we're gonna hit all the tables in the order shown on this map. Excuse me, can you help me?
Sure, what can I do for you?
I'm kinda lost and I'm looking for post 61. Which way is it?
Oh, I think you'll find the post section in the East Hall.
How do I get to the East Hall?
This is the West Hall. You need to get in that line over there and head upstairs. That'll take you right over to the East Hall.
How long do you think it'll take for me to get there?
Right now? I think it'll take about an hour.
I wasn't paying attention and I got washed away by the crowd. What kind of place is this? I had to stand in line for the bathroom and it took an hour. I figured the little shopping list I gave you was gonna be too much for a first-timer. It's all good. Let's take it easy and look around for the rest of the day.
I don't think this is gonna work, guys.
Just ask someone if they know Wesley.
Pardon me. Do you know anyone named Wesley? Yeah, definitely not sure this is gonna work.
This dork, he has a convention now? Come on, what are we
we doing?
Huh? Tuxedo scuba lessons? Ooh, a signing with Catherine's Alpha through Omega Joneses.
More like trying too hard, Con.
Guests or professionals?
Guests.
Guests are fans, Morty, which we are not. We'd like professional badges.
Do you have a crew?
Yes, he's a getaway driver with Asperger's, and my butthole is a demolitions expert. How much is it to get in?
If you want professional badges, you need to put a crew together.
Or we could sneak in, like professionals.
Can't wait.
Oh, for God's sake. And you wonder why we aren't fans.
Ooh, I like this one.
That's hand-stitched. They're $95.
$95? You could buy an actual saddle for that. Okay, never mind. I guess I can't get you a new saddle, girl. Don't look at me like that.
Nice chariot doll. Is it your dad's?
No, it's mine.
So excited!
All right, so that's kind of little clips of how cons have been represented in pop culture. You can kind of see the evolution from a little bit mean-spirited to a little bit more lighthearted. I'm going to talk about how the public has reacted to cons over the years. But to introduce myself, you might know me as Transformative, or Bash the Pinata, or an Animorphs, or Chocolate Pony, or South Park Dallas, whatever fandom I'm in. I've been doing cons for over 10 years now. In fact, this is my 10th year vending full-time as a full-time job. I studied genetic biology at Johns Hopkins University. There is where I kind of thought of the idea, how about we look at the evolution of conventions and fandoms the same way we look at the evolution of organic organisms. And thus, this is where I started to create my own timeline of convention history. So I've been working on a history book now. And I like doing this panel at a bunch of cons, anime cons, comic cons, brony cons, furry cons, to show that all these different fandoms, whether they like to think of it or not, are not stuck in some tiny bubble. All these fandoms have been affecting each other. All these fandoms kind of had their influence. And I want to show how all these different cons are all part of a larger family tree. So to begin, like I said, I'm working on a history book. I don't know if it's going to come out anytime soon. I'm still working on it, so it's been a long project. But like I said, I've been kind of working on this idea of a convention evolutionary tree. And in fact, after the panel, you could pick up one of the flyers where I have a mini version of the timeline up here. And we're going to be using these timelines to kind of look at how I classify all these different conventions. So we're going to be looking at the furry cons right here, but I want to kind of show the roots of the furry cons from the main branch, which I'm going to use as the science fiction cons being the main branch, and how the science fiction cons kind of gave way to all these different communities and fandoms. And we're going to focus specifically, there's a bunch of different types of fan cons, but we're going to specifically focus on just a few of them. So let me see where the mouse is right now. So we're going to kind of focus on the science fiction cons, which will include the fantasy cons, the anime cons, comic cons, furry cons, and then there's two fandom specific cons I'm going to elevate to the same level. These are going to be the Trekkies and the Bronies, because both of these types of cons had such a big impact on the convention scene. It's kind of fair to give them the same recognition as all these other groups. And I'm going to talk about how each element developed uniquely within some of these cons and what made them different. But here's kind of the rough timeline we're going to look at. And we're going to start right here in the late 1930s, where we're going to see the very first science fiction conventions. Now, the problem with the term convention is it's a very, very broad term. Where do we draw the line of what a convention is? Is a meetup a convention? Is an author book signing a convention? Is a Renaissance fair a convention? So you could really draw the line almost everywhere, but for my definition, I'm going to use what I consider a convention is a pop culture convention specifically based on the Worldcon model. And when I say Worldcon model, it's because I use Worldcon as my definition as basically the template for every single con that came afterwards. Some people might have some different theories, but let's start with Worldcon first before we finally get to the furry conventions. So 1938 is the start of the golden age of science fiction. Coincidentally, it's also the start of the golden age of comics. Maybe not so coincidentally, all these genres were kind of considered under the same umbrella. So nowadays we retroactively use the term speculative fiction to refer to this period that refers to space operas and sword and sorcery fantasy. But in reality, science fiction was kind of the catch-all term for all pop culture during this period. So not just fans of space operas, for example. Science fiction also referred to fantasy, also referred to people who like anthropomorphic animals, also referred to comics, also referred to cartoons. So we're going to see basically the term for the general multimedia event kind of evolve over time, but during this period, science fiction is that general term. So during this period, this is where we started to get the first kind of science fiction book clubs. Now, science fiction as a genre wasn't seen as high literature during this period. Science fiction fans were upset that sci-fi authors were not getting the recognition they deserved from the literary world. So you had a large group of science fiction fans basically do little book meetups, had their own little fanzines. Basically, this was the pre-internet days, so the fanzines were the social media communication of this time period, and they wanted to find ways to kind of promote and help recognize some of these authors of their field. Now, during this period, you had a lot of different meetups, so a lot of science fiction fan gatherings, and these are some of the earliest ones that have direct roots to the science fiction cons that would develop. Now, of course, there are a bunch of meetups for science fiction fandoms as early as the Victorian era. You could even argue beforehand. But we're going to specifically focus on these ones because these are the ones that a lot of people say are a contender for the first convention. So if you ask any old school science fiction fans, so specifically people who are part of what's called the first fandom, most science fiction fans will kind of refer to these first two events as their first convention. So you have PhilCon in Philadelphia, also known as the first Eastern Conference. Then you have the Leeds event, also known as the first British Conference. Now, by my definition of cons I've been using, I don't really consider these conventions. These are essentially one-day meetups that had basically about 10 to 14 people basically gather in someone's house, a public library, and basically just do a little talk, say, hey, we're from Philadelphia, hey, we're from New York, talk about the fandom a bit, and then leave. There was nothing we could really identify with major conventions. And it's also kind of odd that the science fiction fans would consider these two the first science fiction cons, when the first Science Fiction League meeting happened a year before, basically the same number of attendees. It actually took place over 2 days. But the reason why these science fiction fans don't consider this the first con is because it didn't have the term conference in its title. So if we're going to be doing it based on semantics, then, everything's out the window there. So I don't consider these, the first conventions. By my definition, I will consider the first Worldcon the first convention. This is why I say this is the Worldcon model. So Worldcon was basically kind of modeled off of the World's Fair that was happening in New York during this year. And it was essentially basically trying to be a large gathering of science fiction fans all in one space. Now, the elements that Worldcon had that I would mark it as being considered the first convention is because it had a lot of prototypes that we will kind of identify with modern conventions. So if you look at this first Worldcon, there's a lot of stuff you could identify with even a con like this con happening right now, FurryCon happening right now. So first, Worldcon was the first convention to be held over the course of 3 days, which is kind of the standard with most pop culture cons now. It's held over the weekend. It was held over Independence Day weekend, so similar to what AnthroCon does now. It had over 100 attendees. It had basically what I call the hotel con model. So basically, the convention will rent out the hotel and everyone gather with all the events happening within the same hotel venue. So I think that's one of the big differences between the first meetings and Worldcon. And it also had a full programming schedule. So as opposed to random people's talking, it actually had a program of events. In fact, I think it was interesting because on the last day of the convention, they had a baseball game between the science fiction fans of New York and Philadelphia. And I kind of wish that cons continue the baseball game tradition. I think that's kind of a fun element. But you also had some of the earliest cosplay. In fact, this is long before the term cosplay was coined, but you had people dressing up as pop culture characters at these events. And eventually, as Worldcon would evolve, it would have a lot of different elements we could identify with modern cons. It would have an art show, which would eventually become the dealer's hall for some cons. They would have the masquerade at the next one, and they would even introduce the concept of having badge and badge ribbons, something we kind of identify as a con. In fact, I used the badge and badge ribbon as a logo for my con history project because it's so identifiable with conventions. In fact, the first Dead Dog Party was actually held at the first Worldcon. And we can even trace the exact date of the Dead Dog Party. Nowadays, Dead Dog is an informal term referring to kind of the last dance or last party of an event. Most often it refers to the staff party. After everything's all shut down, the staff have one party, normally in the con suite. So we could really trace almost every single element that we see here at a con like Vernal Equinox all the way to this first Worldcon, which is why I draw my definition of what a convention is based off this model, because you could see a clear line from this first Worldcon all the way to a con like San Diego Comic-Con or Comic-Con or even BronyCon. So a lot of the different elements of Worldcon, like I said, it had a con book and con programming, so we could see some of the early con programming. And what I think is actually interesting is this is a fanzine someone drew of their experience at the first Worldcon, and you can see he drew his experience picking up badges in the Reg line. This was furthermore the other weekend right here. So I did this panel last weekend at Furthermore. You can see they also had a long badge pickup. So in the over 80 years since the first convention to now, the badge pickup line has not changed. So that's something that's always been constant. Now, the other Worldcons also start to add more and more elements that we will identify with conventions. So Worldcon is unique because it's kind of like the Olympics. Like I said, it was kind of based off the World's Fair, but it's not held in any specific city every year. Basically, each city has a local science fiction club that kind of puts a bid for Worldcon, and if they win the bid, they get to host the Worldcon for the next year. So most of these biddings would take place on the party floor. If Dublin held a better party than New Zealand, they normally will win the bid for the Worldcon. So kind of throwing an impressive party is what gets your city voted to host the next Worldcon. And that I think that's really unique because most cons now we identify with a specific city. AmperCon with Pittsburgh, San Diego Comic-Con with San Diego. Worldcon doesn't have one group of people kind of holding the copyright. It's just, I guess by some honor system, they pass down the term Worldcon, of course the Hugo Awards, again and again every year. So the party floor is the most important part of these early conventions, and as I will show, a lot of cons evolved from the room party floor. So talking about the room party floor, we have the first con suite, which was held at the second Worldcon in Chicago in 1940. And Chicago Worldcon was also the first time we had a costume masquerade. So as I will explain later, the costume masquerade will eventually evolve into a cosplay contest at some anime cons, but within the realm of furry cons, it would eventually evolve into what we now identify as the fursuit parade, and it's an interesting line from the masquerade to that. But this is also where we had the first organized filking. So filk is fan music, and I'm going to talk about that a bit. So you can see the roots of all convention music with filk music. In fact, the roots of all modern fandom music to filk music. Now, the term filk was actually coined in the 50s based off a typo in the con book. It was supposed to be spelling folk, but it's spelled filk. So while the first organized filking was at the second Worldcon, the very first filk music that organically happened at the first Worldcon. So essentially, you had a group of New York science fiction cans called the Futurians, who were kind of more socialist-leaning, workers' party type activists who would sing protest music, because remember this is right after the Great Depression, and they would sporadically go to the lobby of the hotel, find empty panel rooms, and start singing these protest songs. And basically, and you see this happening still today and again, you have empty panel rooms where people just randomly come in with a guitar and people join in and sing music. You have a lobby of the hotel with a piano and someone just randomly goes up and starts playing and everyone gathers around. So this is kind of the roots of filk music. And over time, as more and more people passed away and the word to these original protest songs were lost, they would replace these with kind of their own songs about their favorite characters, like Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers or Star Trek. So you would start having these fan-made pop culture songs kind of impromptuly made at these early events, and we could really see how folk music eventually would lead into other forms of con music. So if you go to anime cons, you would sometimes see a random DJ sub in the hallway playing music. If you go to a BronyCon, you would have something called a renegade stage where people who are not assigned to be at the concert would randomly go and play. So the roots of all con music you could really see with folk music. So the next important thing that Worldcon introduced is the Hugo Awards. The Hugo Awards are kind of like the Academy Awards of the science fiction genre. Like I said, these cons were originally formed to kind of recognize and honor the science fiction industry, which was kind of looked down upon. And now the Hugo Awards are really considered the highest literary award in the field at this time. And what's unique about the Hugo Awards, unlike any other awards which are normally voted on by professionals or by some committee, the Hugo Awards are specifically voted on by the attendees of Worldcon. So to vote at the Hugo Awards, you have to either physically attend Worldcon or buy a spirit badge for Worldcon. And this makes it actually unique because Worldcon, like I said, could be held anywhere around the world. So if you see it held in Europe one year, you might see a lot more European science fiction authors being represented on the ballot. It's been held in Japan, where we saw a lot more Japanese authors win. And actually this year, Worldcon is for its first time held in China, so we might see different authors that we might not know about in the West be nominated, and it will be held in Glasgow, Scotland the following year. And I think right now the most serious contender for the 2025 Worldcon is Seattle, so potentially you'll be back in America in Seattle. So, going back about the room parties, you have to remember, like I said, the term science fiction during this period was a catch-all term for all pop culture. So if you were a fan of a specific property or a specific subgenre within science fiction, how did you meet up with your fellow fans? And this is where the party floors really came into play. And so most of these science fiction cons will have a bulletin board kind of in the lobby of the hotel, and you could either write or post in the bulletin board your room party. So for example, if you're a fan of Doctor Who, you might write, Doctor Who fans meet in Hyatt 302 at 8 p.m. and we'll watch some classic Tom Baker episodes, for example. So you had these kind of impromptu gatherings of smaller fandoms within the larger community. And you kind of see this still happening at some cons. At anime cons, you might have specific meetups for specific anime shows. At furry cons, you might have specific meetups for specific species. But this is how a lot of the old science fiction cons would do it. In fact, they've continued this tradition today. If you go to any old science fiction cons, they might still even be using the same bulletin boards they've been passing down decades after decades after decades. Like I think the ones here I took in 2021, and I think these were around since the 80s. And you could actually see the roots of some cons directly from science fiction. So for example, most furry cons, I would say, descended directly from the science fiction cons. So a lot of old school furry cons that were founded in the 90s still have this tradition of having a room party floor with a bulletin board where you could post it. And interesting enough, within the pony convention scene, BabsCon is the only convention that directly had a root with the science fiction scene through BayCon. And BabsCon for the longest time was the only My Little Pony con that actually had a community bulletin board that served with a similar function. So, and some of the other elements I really like is they would have mimeographed newsletter updates like almost once or twice a day. So if a panelist had to cancel or they moved the panel to a different room, this is where people will be posting the updates in these little flyers. So nowadays, con could tweet it out, or if you had a ConBook app, they would just update it on the app. But before you had this type of communication, this is how cons would do the updates for the paneling, and a lot of science fiction cons still continue this tradition for today, which I really like that they keep this going. So, the golden age of science fiction and the golden age of comic books both kind of ended at the same time, in the late 1960s, and both of them also had both of them had very different changes for in which direction they went. Specifically, science fiction, again, the term science fiction included fantasy during this time period, but this is where we kind of got the superficial split between science fiction and fantasy, specifically with a group of individuals, mainly edited by Michael Moorcock, a British science fiction writer with new wave science fiction. Now, as Michael Moorcock, he's actually still alive today. He has some, and if you don't know, he's the one who kind of inspired everyone from like Alan Moore to Neil Gaiman, George R.R. Martin. He's the one who basically coined the the alignment chart, chaotic neutral, all that stuff. He's the one who basically invented that. The Discordian symbol, the symbol of chaos and discord, he invented that. And he's probably the person who also invented the concept of the multiverse. So you might not recognize the name, but he has been as influential in the genre as anyone else has. But he kind of criticized science fiction during its time period because it was basically all cowboys in space, as he would describe it. It was glorious, conquering the stars, and he didn't see it this way. He came up during a generation of war and protests, inequality. This was after the world wars, and he saw the world as stuck in a place of turmoil. There's racism, classism, inequality, pollution. And if we don't kind of wake ourselves up to the realities of the world, then we're going to inherit a very, very dark future. So a lot of the authors in the new wave science fiction scene started to pivot directly against what J.R.R. Tolkien was doing, and he basically shifted the fantasy genre into what we now call high fantasy. And you could really see a summarization between both Moorcock and Tolkien's work in their essays they wrote. Tolkien wrote a essay called On Fairy Stories, where he talks about the purpose of escapism. Yes, the world is bad, the world is cruddy, we need escapism, don't let people talk you down about escapism. Michael Moorcock, on the other hand, wrote two fantastic essays called The Epic Pooh. The other one was called Starship Stormtroopers, that basically point out escapism, yeah, it has its place, but escapism is bad if you continuously go into escapist fiction instead of trying to address the problems of the world. We're never going to change the world. So this is where you start getting stories like V for Vendetta or Fahrenheit, 1984, trying to change the structure of the world. And this is where we really see the split between the two genres. And this is where the fantasy cons kind of split off from what we call the hard science fiction cons. Looking at the other genre, we have the comic books, and this is where they enter the Silver Age of comics. There are different areas, but both Marvel and DC both entered their respective Silver Ages around the same time. So specifically, the Silver Age of comics with DC kind of begins with the Flash of Two Worlds. This is what introduces the multiverse into DC Comics. And with Marvel Comics, it's around the time when Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and Jack Kirby created the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man. Now, this is where comics are really coming about, because up to this point, comics were kind of considered a subgenre of science fiction. So there wasn't any comic cons. If you were a comic book fan, you would be going to these science fiction cons. However, the comic fans started to make their own zines where they started to chat and communicate. And just like how these old science fiction zines eventually evolved into the first science fiction cons, a lot of these comic zines were putting around the idea of a comic convention. In fact, one of them said the comic fandom will not be a fandom in its own right until it's had its own convention. And this is where a group of high school kids decided to do a thing and basically created New York Comic Con, the very first Comic Con. Now, Worldcon was the first con that I used by my definition because it was held over the course of 3 days. But you'll start seeing a lot of these cons start as one-day cons, the Comic Cons and the Anime Cons. So they don't fall neatly into my definition of what I laid out with Worldcon, but they would have a lot of elements and pick up things that Worldcon eventually would develop. So New York Comic Con was held one day. A group of high school students basically pitched around this idea, even saying, hey, we could hold it in our own house if we need to. And basically had rented out a small little room in a community center and had the first convention. You could kind of see a map of the convention in the bottom. It was essentially just one giant dealer's room with 6 dealers at this time, and that was it. And you'll notice the difference between the science fiction cons and the comic cons. The science fiction cons were more about programming, while the comic cons are more about the dealers. And I think this is interesting. Before I actually was looking at some of the early science comic cons, I kind of did notice the trend. And you could kind of see the distinction because science fiction cons were basically fan-run volunteer cons, basically made by fans to kind of help support and promote the industry. On the other hand, you start seeing comic cons basically are industry-run events, normally for profit, who are basically trying to attract fans to, give them money. So it's a complete opposite subversion. Now, some of the interesting things that these early comic cons would start developing is what will eventually evolve into the exhibitor hall at a lot of these conventions. So most dealer halls at cons up to this point were kind of like early swap meets. People would just have tables of props, old books, old comics, and that was it. Now, to have a place to kind of sell more and more comics, this is where they would try to attract more guests. So unlike the science fiction cons that basically would have one guest of honor and maybe one fan guest of honor, the comic cons started the trend of let's fill our con book up with tons and tons and tons of guests of honor. Now, this was a way to get a lot of people to come to the con without having to pay them as guests of honor. This is where they created the concept of the Artist Alley. And it's interesting because the Artist Alley developed twice independently, once in America with the Comic Cons and once in Japan with Comic-Con. But the American Artist Alley was essentially a professional artist alley. So these are people who professionally work in the comic book industry. They worked on Batman, they worked on Superman, and this was a way to get a lot of big name artists to come to your convention for free without having to pay them as a guest, to sign books, do commissions, sell original artwork, and this is where we get the start of the professional artist alley. So a lot of these early Comic Cons were heavily inspired or run by kids who grew up with these early science fiction cons. So two individuals I want to point out. One, Sheldorf, basically took over a small fair in Detroit called Chicago Triple Fan Fair, which kind of focused on comics, but it wasn't a comic-specific con. It was just one subsection. He later moved to San Diego in 1970. Then you had Ken Kruger, who attended the first World Con, then later founded the Buffalo Science Fantasy League, and later made his own Buffalo Con in his mom's house. He also moved to San Diego. And it's interesting, these two individuals who were running these small science fiction cons eventually moved to San Diego in 1970, and by coincidence, they met up, they interacted with some other fans, and they decided to start what we now know as San Diego Comic Con, which started as Golden State Comic Book Convention. So this is where we get the birth of San Diego Comic Con. You could see San Diego Comic Con, largest Comic Con in the United States for the longest time until it was replaced by New York Comic Con, which overtook it, had its roots directly within the science fiction con scene. Some other cons that also had their roots were Chicago Comic Con, which started as Nostalgia 72. And like I was saying, this is where the Artist Alley started, but this is also where we get a lot of zine culture and underground comics getting started. Specifically in Austin, Texas and San Francisco, California, these were kind of the two centers for the underground comics movement. This is where you get individuals like Robert Crumb, who made Fritz the Cat. And these were supposed to be comics that were kind of separated from the DC Marvel comics, superhero comics around this time. So you had this entire zine culture kind of develop, and you also had a lot of furry zines kind of pop up. Now again, the term furry wasn't coined around this time, so these were anthropomorphic animal zines, or what we called funny animal comics during this time period. But you start seeing this vast underground evolution. Some of the major groups would be the Air Pirates in San Francisco, and they were the ones who did the parody of Mickey Mouse in their comics that essentially would lead to Disney taking them to court and doing the Mickey Mouse Copyright Protection Act, which extended the copyright laws. But in Japan, you had something similar happening. So in Japan as well, you also had a science fiction convention in Japan that was inspired by Worldcon that would have a little area of their convention for the underground comic fans to kind of draw their own comics and sell them. This area was called the comic market. And very similar to the fan comics, these specifically were fanzines that were very, very similar to what we were seeing in America. There were 8 to 10 page little short comics that took a lot of popular manga or anime characters, and just like a lot of the American comics, like the Tijuana Bibles, a lot of it, 90% of it, was adult sexual comics. So people think, okay, mature artwork and mature comics and fan art is a modern thing. No, it's been around since the beginning. In Japan, these fan-made comics are called dondinshi, and this is where you had a dondinshi or the doujin artists who formed these circles. Essentially, these groups would become so big they would overexpand the original science fiction cons they were hosting, and eventually Comic Market, what we now shorten as Comiket, was formed from these groups of people. They started to hold their own con called Comic Market, and Comiket developed a new type of artist alley. So as opposed to the artist alley that was developing in America, which were basically filled with people from the profession and industry, the artist alleys in Japan were filled with fan-made artists basically selling fan art and fan comics of characters they don't own the copyright to. Now, the laws in Japan are a little bit more lax, and for the most part, these two different artist alleys will develop across the sea independently of each other. It's only in the 90s, when the anime cons really have their foot in America, that this will start causing trouble. But at the meantime, you have these two different artist alleys developing from very, very similar situations in the underground comics movement. Now, this is where we're going to start looking at the next really big jumping point in the convention evolution scene. So we have this giant light blue blur that I kind of put in the middle of the science fiction con. So you see the red coming off is the comic cons, and the yellow is the indie comics like Comiket and the zine comics. Now we're going to focus on this giant group, which is going to introduce a new type of fandom, and this is where the Trekkies come into play. So like I said, Trekkies and the Bronies are the two fandom-specific groups that really had a big impact on the scene, and I'm going to kind of explain why. So Gene Roddenberry at Worldcon 1966 basically announced, I'm working on a new show called Star Trek. So basically he was doing what Warner Brothers and Disney is doing now, going to San Diego Comic-Con announcing, hey, we have a new superhero movie coming out. He was basically doing this decades before all these industries started to do it, and I think he hit the right audience because he was promoting to Worldcon. It was Worldcon and these science fiction cons that were also heavily helping promote his new show, Star Trek, which became really, really popular. And there were some issues of it. Was it going to be renewed? Was it going to be canceled? So you started to see a lot of new science fiction fans entering the science fiction con scene. Now, this causes some problems because the science fiction cons, like I said, were created by now the old guard who started these cons in the 1930s, now seeing this new wave of young, hip fans talking about this new TV show that none of them care about or heard about. And there is a problem because programming for conventions since the 1930s all the way to the 70s for 40 years only had one program room and one programming track. So basically, how you were supposed to do these programs is everyone in the small convention will come into the programming room. They'll see the program, they'll see the panel, they'll leave, take a break, and come back. Essentially, you had one panel room with a set list of programming. And when you have a bunch of non-Star Trek fans now pitching Star Trek panels, you're going to start seeing a lot of Star Trek panels on the list, and a lot of the old science fiction fans are like, we don't care about this show. Why would we even bother going to the panels? So it took them 40 years to figure it out, but the cons are finally like, hey, we could hold more than one panel at the same time. And boom, you got the birth of what we call multi-track programming, or the programming track. So now, thanks to the influx of Star Trek fans filling these cons, they decided to split up the programs into different programming rooms. And a lot of cons still kind of continue to this tradition. So you might have a programming room that's just fantasy, a programming room that's just furry, a programming room that's just alternate history, for example. And a lot of programming still do that. So a lot of cons still have a writing track specific programming room. And so after the Trekkies kind of filled out these science fiction cons, they were like, hey, we could actually start our own Star Trek specific conventions, and that's what they started to do. So the very first Star Trek con is Star Trek Lives, which was in New York City, and it's actually going to be interesting, but we're going to notice the first con of every genre is going to be kind of started in New York. But Star Trek Lives started in New York. It had 3,000 attendees, which is impressive because I don't even think this con has 3,000 attendees. So imagine a brand new convention right out the door, 3,000 attendees. Very impressive. This next year they had 6,000 attendees. The third year, Ticketmaster, which was around back then and also messes up back then, sold 15,000 tickets and they had to turn away at least another 6,000 attendees. So imagine, this is like really the first con to hit the 5-digit mark, and it was all around this small show called Star Trek back then. This is also why Star Trek's the Trekkies kind of become the model for, like I was showing at the beginning of the panel, whenever they wanted to mock cons or show a parody of what a con was, they normally always show Trekkies at a convention. And this is why, because the Trekkies really dominated the con scene during this period. And while the Trekkies didn't start it, they popularized a lot of concepts that kind of be integrated into the mainstream culture. So the idea of slash fiction, shipping. In this specific period, it's also where we see two canonically straight male characters put into homosexual relationships during this period. This was very, very popular in the Star Trek fandom. Specifically, Kirk and Spock was the common ship during this period. Even though you could go all the way back to the Sherlock fandom doing this, it was really when it was popularized across all these different fandoms around this period. Fan fiction, self-insert fan fictions became very, very popular. This is where we get the term Mary Sud coin as well. So this is where Trekkies really kind of held their own, and I made these graphs to kind of show you. So Worldcon, like I said, was the first con by my definition, and the largest for the period, and also we could also see San Diego Comic-Con. So Worldcon's in blue, San Diego Comic-Con's in red, and boom, you see the Trekkies with their Star Trek cons just instantly dwarfing them right out the door. But then you also see it was a big influx, and then started to trickle down. And that trickle down was because the show ended, the original series ended. It would be a while before Next Generation came about. So the Trekkies kind of had their big conventions, the cons dwindled, and the Trekkies kind of went integrated back into the science fiction convention scene. And we'll see a very similar thing with Bronies a few decades later. But some of the things the Trekkies did, like I said, they were the ones who introduced us to the idea of having more than one panel at the same time. They also introduced show-specific canon cosplay, because up to this point, most cosplay done at cons were based on someone's imagination, because most of the fiction during this period were short stories and anthologies or science fiction novels where there was really no specific outfit for these characters. So a lot of people created these outfits from imagination. So Star Trek and Doctor Who as well were really the first where you could get show-accurate cosplays done, and this is where cosplays really came about. You had charity auctions, you had basically dealer rooms explode, so this is where we get people who would sell props from the show, scripts, all this stuff happening. And like I said, they became the model for the longest time of how people would stereotype or portray nerds in pop culture, until recently. So the Trekkies came out of the gate, and then people thought, hey, we can make money out of cons, because again, for the longest time, cons were volunteer non-profit events, and all of a sudden you have Creation Con emerge that started to say, okay, well, we could kind of make our own for-profit Star Trek cons. And before the era of ReedPop or Wizard World, you had Creation Con basically now strategically making their own professional run con around the country. This is the period where also the term gopher was coined. And this was also the period where the word cosplay was coined during the 80s. Now, this is also where we get the group of a lot of con volunteer security forces. So if you're on the East Coast, you normally would see Flare running. Actually, West Coast, you have Flare. So if you've ever been to, I think, Further Confusion, Flare normally runs it. Then on the East Coast and Midwest, You would have the Dorsey regulars who would kind of do the security of the cons. And so you would have basically a group of security who are basically all fan run, basically volunteer at a bunch of different cons. And also the term gopher, like I said, was coined. And this is also when the Star Trek cons, as they started to fall basic in attendance numbers, started to rebrand themselves as multi-genre, multimedia cons. So this is where the first baton is passed. Science fiction was the general pop culture cons of this time period, and now the baton is passed to these former Star Trek cons, who now become basically all-encompasses multimedia conventions. Now, this is also the period where room parties also come into play. Like I said, how do you meet with different fans around the different fans of specific fandoms? This is where you go to the room parties. And specifically, you start seeing room parties for Japanese pop culture. So while Comiket is happening in Japan, right now in America, you're not seeing a lot of what we will call anime. During this time period, the term anime wasn't even coined. It was called Japanimation during this period, and most anime would only see probably localized dubs in Hawaii or the Pacific coast, and so a lot of people in the eastern and midwest of the United States and Canada are not seeing any of this anime. So the only way to really see anime is for someone to kind of record a bootleg copy of these one-time test air episodes and basically distribute it at these different conventions. So you start seeing a lot of fan groups start about with trying to record these bootleg anime, then show them at these different conventions. And you would have a bunch of different groups founded. The main one that also kind of, welcome. Those are my roommates. Welcome to our panel. So, find a seat if you can. I think there's seats up here too if you want. Yes.
No way.
Welcome. All right.
Hey, we got one more. Sorry.
Well, one more? Okay.
Yeah.
So, the Cartoon Fancy Organization, that's kind of not only the grandfather of all anime cons in America, it's also the grandfather of the furry cons. But let's talk about the anime side. So the Cartoon Fancy Organization was kind of formed as one of the main ways to kind of distribute anime around the United States. So it was formed in 1977 by Mark Merlino and Fred Patton. So these are two of the individuals a lot of people consider the father of the modern furry fandom, Mark and Fred, and they were based out of Los Angeles. This is also why the first FurryCon conference was also based in Southern California. And it was specifically a way to kind of, help coordinate the showing of anime at these different room parties. And over time, not only were they showing bootleg anime, they got permission by some of the Japanese studios to actually release the official anime in some cases. So the official anime releases would be at these room parties. They started to form different chapters around the United States. They formed a New York chapter, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of different chapters forming around the country, and all of a sudden these chapters are kind of closed, and eventually the original group in Los Angeles remained the only one. And this is where we get the Cartoon Fancy Organization, kind of branching off of the science fiction timeline and leading into the American anime cons and the furry cons. And see that here with their mascots. So what's unique about the Cartoon Fancy Organization is even though they were specifically an anime fan club, they would use anthropomorphic animals as their logo. And this is where we're going to get into some interesting stuff. But let's talk about the weeboos and the otaku first. The anime fans. And I'm doing an anime con next weekend, so that's where I'm going to talk about them a little bit more. Did you have a question? Or?
Yeah. So because I'm not good with real names, Mark Merlino is Sisable, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. So, like I said, you had the Japanese science fiction cons and the Japanese Comic-Con, Comiket, developing already in Japan. So the anime scene is kind of evolving from the science fiction Comic Cons that are happening in Japan during this time, mainly with Comiket kind of introducing a lot of the structures that a lot of American Comic Cons will introduce. Now, while A-Con in Dallas, Texas is kind of considered the first 3-day anime con, so by my model, 3 days is normally what I use as the basis for what I call the WorldCon model, you have a lot of one-day anime cons or a lot of cons that kind of start to introduce anime. And what's interesting is all these started happening in Texas. So you have the Dallas Fantasy Fair, which was the first multi-genre con to kind of focus on anime, happened in 1982 in Dallas. Then you have YamotoCon, which is kind of a university convention, which formed a one-day anime con in their school gymnasium. The following year, also in Dallas, Texas, and then A-Con finally doing the first 3-day anime con also in Dallas, Texas. So something about Dallas, Texas is happening with all this stuff. Now, anime cons would start introducing a lot of stuff to America that kind of was only present at the Japanese conventions. So up to this point, aside from folk music, the only convention music that was really happening was folk music. You never really saw any convention have any type of organized concerts, raves, or dance. In fact, if you look at the timeline, when anime cons came to America, all the cons that formed after that, the furry cons, the brony cons, all have some type of concert as a main event. Every con that was formed beforehand, even big ones like San Diego Comic-Con, do not have any type of concert. So a lot of these early anime cons in America is starting to import the Japanese style of raves and dancing and cosplay contests, and this is where we get the organized concert element introduced to the American convention scene. Also, this is where we get the Comic-Con style of Artist Alley, again, different from the industry Artist Alley that the Comic-Cons were developing, come to America. So now you have Artist Alley specifically for people who draw fan art, which starts becoming contentious because we have different fan art rules in America. And the fact that both anime cons and comic cons use the same term, Artist Alley, to refer to two totally completely different things also starts to cause a lot of confusion during this period. But what's uniquely American is the concept of having an anime music video, because a lot of these people did not understand Japanese. So they would take these bootleg recordings of a lot of Japanese anime and find rock songs that kind of appropriate maybe the feelings or actions of what they were seeing. And this is where we get the idea of having an anime music video, or AMVs, and almost every single anime con now will have an AMV contest. So this is something that's uniquely an anime thing. So over time, you start seeing a bunch of different anime cons, specifically in the 90s, start to form about. AnimeCon in 1991 was the first to break 1,000 attendees. So again, the Trekkies had a bigger showing than the Otaku. But AnimeCon eventually rebranded as Anime Expo in 1992, and it's still currently the largest anime con in North America. Very hard to get into. So we'll talk about that. But let's go back to the other half. This is what we're all here for. This is our community, the furries. So the Skilter was kind of the mascot that they used as the logo for the Cartoon Fantasy organization. It's a kind of a hybrid alien weasel-like creature created by Mark in 1971, and it's actually used as the name of their furry household in California, and again, the mascot of their organization. In fact, if you even see the most recent furry documentary, The Fandom, you'll notice it's a modernized version of that creature also on the DVD cover. Now, again, this was a period when the term anime still wasn't coined. This was also a period when the term furry wasn't coined yet. So you start seeing anime cons evolve from these showings, but then you had basically the shell of these former anime groups like the Cartoon Fantasy organization, who now still wanted to host parties, but now anime cons were a thing. So they started to focus on one element of the anime they liked, the anthropomorphic animals, or as they would call them, the funny animals during this period. And you start seeing funny animal fan parties form around this time. The first one we could really track is the Prancing Skilter Party in 1985 at WesterCon. WesterCon is an older science fiction con specifically held in North America, normally the West Coast. So it's normally held anywhere from Canada, the United States, to Mexico. So while Worldcon could be held anywhere around the world, WesterCon specifically North America, and WesterCon was the first to host their funny animal fan party. San Diego Comic-Con also hosted one, an Anthro Party. And over time, you start seeing this community of anthropomorphic animals kind of evolve. This is also the advent of the internet, so you start seeing a lot of proto-social media groups, proto-forums during this time. Specifically, you would have online roleplay chat groups called MUDs, and then you would have specific ones that are around anthropomorphic animals, and instead of calling them MUDs, they'll call them mucks. So you'll have furry mucks, which are basically RP chats formed from these different groups. And specifically, these funny animal parties got so big, they decided, hey, just like the anime parties got so big, they became anime cons, why not spin them off? And what's unique about the furry cons, you have to remember, this is very unique. Unlike science fiction or fantasy, which are genres, unlike comics or anime, which are industries, unlike Trekkies or Bronies, which are franchise-specific fandoms, furries can't be categorized into any one of these categories. Furries aren't an industry, they aren't a genre, they aren't a franchise-specific fandoms. For example, you might have people who like Lion King, but not everyone in the furry fandom is there because of Lion King. Not everyone is there in the fandom because of movies or television. So furries are the most broad of these conventions, but also weirdly the most unique of this type. So you start having the term furry finally become coined around this time, and the first furry convention held a conference which was held in 1989, so technically beating out A-Kon, but it had a small showing, about 95 attendees, so much smaller than the Trekkies, so furries kind of came out very small, but eventually they would start to grow. But what the furry cons started to do is introduce a lot of elements directly from the science fiction model. So when comic cons or anime cons or the Trekkie cons formed, they kind of reinvented everything that the science fiction cons brought before. The furry cons basically kept almost every single element in place. So they kept the hotel room rate model, they kept the staffing structure, they kept the multi-track programming, they kept the room party floor. So they kind of kept everything in a very similar light. And so as furries started to move out of the science fiction and comic cons, you would see a lot of comic cons and anime cons try to bring furries back. So Worldcon made a furry lounge to kind of keep some of the furries there as well. Conference was the first furry con to get over 1,000 attendees, and after 14 years, let me see, I think I have the list, eventually closed. But let's talk about some of the carryovers. So like I said, a lot of the elements from the science fiction scene carried over to the furries, but would evolve in very different ways. So most science fiction cons have a hospitality suite. So basically it's a large giant room where you can rest and relax. And normally a lot of people would bring food kind of potluck style to feed people throughout the weekend, because again, science fiction cons, you're technically not an attendee, you're a member. You're paying for a membership to this basically essentially a business meeting. So all the food at the convention is essentially paid for by your mission. So if you go to a science fiction con like Balticon, they will have just a soda fountain there for free, they'll have pizza, they'll have potluck food. That's kind of how most science fiction cons do it. Over time, most of the furry cons also kept this element, but because it became more and more expensive to give food out to attendees as the cons started to grow in their thousands and thousands, they eventually got rid of the free food aspect, and essentially these just became gathering spaces. So the hospitality suite eventually lost the food and just became the zoo. Dealers' halls were essentially just became the dealer's den. Most old school furry cons still kept the art show, so art show with the art auction and charity bidding still became a part of that. And like I said, the masquerade, the basically showing off your cosplay on stage, that used to be the highlight of science fiction cons. From the very first masquerade in 1940 all the way till today, Saturday night, the big main event panel is a bunch of cosplayers going on stage doing little skits and stuff. Now, when conference started, they decided to keep the masquerade. Again, this is before the term fursuit was coined, and they decided to have the animal costume shows. Instead of keeping it on Saturday night, they moved it to Saturday afternoon. The problem was now the dealers couldn't see this, so they decided after the masquerade to march all the costumed fursuiters through the dealers hall so everyone could see them, and this is where we get the evolution of the fursuit parade. Over time, a lot of the cons got rid of the masquerade and now just kept the fursuit parade. Cosplay Lounge essentially became the headless lounges, and of course, folk music eventually evolved into the furry concerts. But I would say the furry concerts only really came about after the Brony style got into the mix, but that's for later in the panel. So let's talk about Conference a bit. It was held mostly in Southern California, around where the original Cartoon Fantasy organization was formed, and it really kind of ended after Mark stepped down after his 10th year, and some other individuals took it over. And the very last one was in 2003, so you could kind of see the boom and grow. And I think one of the main reasons why it kind of shrank in attendees was because it moved. It's normally always held in January. It moved to April. And then Further Confusion in San Jose started in January. And Further Confusion also in California essentially kind of took most of the original attendees away. And that's kind of where it fell about. Some other elements that got influenced, the folks of Conference also had a small little gathering at San Diego Comic-Con. So Comic-Cons are normally just a day event. There's no after dark groups, panels, or dances or concert at Comic-Cons. So after like 8 p.m., that was it for even big cons like San Diego Comic-Con. So to kind of have something fun for furries, they would have a hotel across the street where you could pay $5 to walk in, and you have small dealers kind of selling furry themed stuff. Conference East then became the East Coast equivalent to try to make their own furry con. And so you have to remember, during this time period, the term conference was a genericized term for a furry convention. So now we would say furry con to refer to furry con, but conference was that term during this period. And so Conference East actually has no connections to the original conference, but it was formed as a way for the East Coast furry scene to kind of have their own group. Also directly descended from the science fiction con scene. So PhilCon, remember the one that most people say is the first convention, had there was a big group of Philadelphia furries who were helping out, including Uncle Kage during this period as well, before he became a chair of Anthrocon. But there was some, I guess, rumors of anti-furry bias. Like, furries were not being accepted into the dealer's hall, they were not being accepted into the art show. So because they felt like they were being kicked out of their con, just like how the Trekkies were kind of kicked out of some of these older science fiction cons, these group of Philadelphia furries decided to form Conference East, and they ended up making Uncle Kage kind of their guest of honor. So we can kind of see the evolution of Conference. Started in Philadelphia, then moved around New Jersey, Cleveland, and it was canceled. Kind of the spiritual successor to that was Albany Anthrocon. Albany Anthrocon started in Albany, and essentially stayed there until Uncle Kage was made a guest of honor. The year he was made guest of honor, they actually also made him a chair, so he kind of kept that job since the 90s. And Uncle Kage wanted to remove it to his hometown in Philadelphia in 2001. And because of how bad the elevators were, they kind of nicknamed it StairCon, but elevator issues at furry cons have always been a thing, so, you know. Uncle Kage actually, as a staffer of PhilCon, knew within the PhilCon constitution, PhilCon is responsible for helping fund monies for smaller cons who wanted to be formed in the Philadelphia area. And so he basically went to a PhilCon business meeting, waited in the back, asked, "Hey, can I have money for a furry convention?" And they're like, "No, yeah, you have to get on your knees and beg." And he literally got on his knees and begged. And PhilCon said, so like, okay, so they gave him money. And after he kind of got the money to move to help with Albany Anthrocon, Albany was dropped, essentially became Anthrocon. Then all of a sudden, Pittsburgh started to lobby Uncle Kage to move the city from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Uncle Kage had to be convinced, and essentially when he went to Pittsburgh, after they convinced him, it's like, all right, let's do it. And I think that really started a relationship that was strong. I think it's one of the strongest relationship I see between a city and convention, Pittsburgh and Anthrocon, even stronger than San Diego and Comic-Con, I would argue, especially how well Pittsburgh has been welcoming furries a lot lately. Now, to kind of, you have to remember that just like the Trekkies, the furries were kind of criticized and mocked during this period. And so to kind of reingratiate themselves back into the community, the furries would do a lot of charity auctions to kind of help out. But the charity auctions during this period were called the pet auctions. And Uncle Kari thought that sounded a little bit too adult, so he tried to make it a little more PG and just renamed the pet auctions to charity auctions. But furry cons really started to get the ball rolling with charity auctions in the convention scene. Another major con that emerged during this period is Midwest Fur Fest, also emerged from a science fiction con that had a furry programming track. Essentially, the furries also felt like they were being kind of not well represented, started to form their own convention. The furry track outgrew DuckCon, and Midwest Fur Fest was held as an independent con. Then the year after Midwest Fur Fest was formed, DuckCon started to lose attendance. So to try to get back the furries, they invited Uncle Kage as like a guest of honor. So you can kind of see a lot of these furry cons coming from these science fiction cons and started losing attendees once the furry cons started to branch off from them. But these two would be the largest furry cons for most of the period. So Anthrocon was the very first furry con to break 5,000 attendees in 2012. So the Trekkies broke out within their second year. So it took the furries at least 2 decades to kind of get to that point. And Midwest Fur Fest was the first to break 10,000 attendees in 2018. And the furries also beat them to that too. So you could see Trekkies and bronies beating the furries at the attendance number. So some other major conventions, furry cons that performed during this period was Further Confusion. That was the one that kind of overtook Fur Conference, Megaplex in Orlando, where I'm currently living, Furry Week in Atlanta. And this is also where we get the group called the Burn Furs, who are kind of a group to try to keep the fandom pure and PG. And we don't really need to get into that, but you see similar movements happen across all different convention scenes. So you would have the Sad Puppies in the science fiction con scene, Gamergate and Comicgate in the anime and science fiction cons. Especially during the Me Too movement, you'll see a lot of different like reactionary movements also come about. But talking about that, so Trekkies, furries, and bronies all kind of experience very, very similar discrimination. And I think I'll talk about that once I move on to the bronies. But because of the discrimination a lot of the furry cons were getting, they kind of isolated themselves into a little bubble. So like I said, most of these furry cons were based off the 80s, 90s science fiction con model. And even though furries were probably the most tech-savvy con running group for the longest time, for 2 decades, kind of looked like they were still running cons based out of the 90s. Like when I started doing furry cons, like 2016, they were still run like old school science fiction cons. And here's kind of why. Most local areas, so you go to Baltimore or Dallas or Los Angeles, will have the same group of fans helping volunteer and run cons. Con volunteers. So you might have the same group of people volunteer at an anime con, a Star Trek con, an anime con, or a science fiction con. And even though they might not be fans of the same genre, they just love volunteering. They love volunteering to cons. And because of that, all these cons, every time they evolve or innovate or change how they do programming or regline or something, they would kind of share this information and slowly evolve over time. Because the furries were kind of afraid of being mocked, they started to isolate and blacklist the media. Then they would fear the media would start infiltrating through other ways and start to become very, very tight in how their cons are regulated, to the point where they won't even have outside volunteers from other cons come to them unless they're specifically furries. So for almost 2 decades, furries were kind of trapped in this bubble, while all these other cons were innovating with new techniques of how to improve regline or panels. Most of the furry cons were so isolated, they were stuck using the same old system for badge pickup like they had in the 90s, which is why furry cons still have kind of long lines. Most furry cons have also kept the outdated model for programming. If you go to programming at an anime con or comic con, there's normally like a 15-minute or 30-minute break in between. You also have staff in the room helping run AV and stuff. At most furry cons still, the panels run back to back. You don't have staff coming in to clear out rooms, and you don't have AV staff on hand to help you out. So stuff like that. Furry cons were almost like kind of held back. They're kind of like, you go to like a small Amish town. It was kind of like that in the con scene for the longest time until the furry cons started to open up and integrate into the different communities. So we're going to quickly move over to the Brony cons, but before that I had to jump over what was also happening in the 90s with the Comic Cons. So this is where we get a period called the comics boom and bust. Basically Dark Horse Comics, Ninja Turtles, all that stuff, speculators market. So think Beanie Babies, but with comics, think NFTs, but with comics. But this is also where you get a lot of people trying to corporatize and run cons professionally. Like we had Creation Con with the Star Trek cons back in the 70s, but it was really during this period where it happened. And I think I have to thank you Canadians for this, because you Canadians created something called Fan Expo Canada. Fan Expo Canada then decided to go around the United States and buy up some of the oldest running science fiction and comic cons, and then just turn them into a corporate rebranding of Fan Expo. So for example, Dallas Comic Con was bought by Fan Expo and just rebranded as Fan Expo Dallas. And you start seeing this happening again and again, these fan-run cons being bought up by these large corporations and rebranded. Wizard Magazine used to be a speculator magazines on comic prices, essentially bought Chicago Comic Con, one of the oldest Comic Cons in the United States, and rebranded it as Wizard World Chicago. Then essentially, I think Wizard World was just bought out by Fan Expo, so now Wizard World Chicago is now Fan Expo Chicago. So you start seeing this entire movement of trying to corporatize cons, and that becomes a little bit tricky. This is also where video games come from the trade show model, because video games are really descend from the consumer electronic trade show model and start mimicking the Comic-Con models for a lot of these cons. And this is also where you start seeing San Diego Comic-Con kind of take off in ticket sales, because before then you could still walk up to San Diego Comic-Con the day of and just buy a ticket and get in, and now it's like they sell it within seconds if you try to book online. San Diego Comic-Con also moves into this market. They rebranded into Comic-Con International. They bought up WonderCon, then Ape Expo. Then you start seeing ReedPop come about from the founders of New York Comic-Con. Interesting about New York Comic-Con, the two founders of New York Comic-Con, let's see if I have them here. The two founders of New York Comic-Con, one of them went off to work for ReedPop. The other one went off to form his own group called Left Field Media that formed AwesomeCon. Two Pacific Northwest cons, one in Portland called Rose City Comic Con, one in Seattle called Emerald City Comic Con, fan-run volunteer cons. Well, ReedPop bought up Emerald City, and then Left Field bought up Rose City, and then when they wanted to move on to the anime cons, ReedPop basically worked with Crunchyroll to make Crunchyroll Expo, and then Left Field Media made Anime NYC and Anime Frontier, powered by Crunchyroll. So you see this weird like incestuous breeding and copying of these two former founders of New York Comic Con. Now, this is where the Trekkies and the furries have a baby that we call the Bronies. So let's talk a little bit about the Bronies. Here's a Brony. Yeah. Well, who here is a Brony? I don't think we have. Okay, so we have a few Bronies. So I'm sure you guys know what Bronies are. So let's just quickly summarize it. So you had a period called the Animation Renaissance in the 90s. Fantastic cartoon shows, Foster's Home, Dexter's Lab, Powerpuff Girls, yada yada. Then Johnny Test and Family Guy came about, and you had an animation dark age for a period. Then all of a sudden you had Adventure Time, Gravity Falls, regular show come about, and then you had an animation revival. One of the big shows that happened during this period was Lauren Faust, who worked during the Animation Renaissance, come and reboot My Little Pony and Generation 4 as My Little Pony Friendship is Witchcraft. Then you have a new group of friends called Bronies come about. Now, what's unique about Bronies are, unlike Trekkies, you could be a Trekkie in like the original series, Next Generation, the J.J. Abrams films, all the way to the new Paramount Plus shows. Bronies are very unique. They are one generation of a franchise. Most Bronies don't care about G1 to 3, and then now you have Gen 5 happening. Most Bronies aren't following that. So Bronies are very unique. They're one specific generation. Now, one individual for BronyCon, Purple Tinker, basically created her first PonyCon, also in New York. All these cons are forming in New York, as a hybrid between Trekkies and the furry con. So she kind of took the Dealers Hall programming model of the furry cons, but kept the guest model of how the Trekkies would do it. So Purple Tinker formed BronyCon in New York City. It had a nice start where it took over the model. The issue with the Brony fandom, as she was actually talking about, is unlike, like I was saying with the Trekkies, that could pull a guest from any generation. You could pull some random background actor from some original series and have them as like a guest of honor at your Star Trek cons. You can't do that with bronies because most bronies aren't going to care about the first 3 generation. And the first PonyCon is happening in 2011, the same year as the first season is already airing. So basically, you don't have... When the Star Trek con started, the show was already ended. All these actors were retired. You could pull them out. You have actors, voice actors, working as the fandom and cons were starting, and this leads into trouble because if you think about My Little Pony, there's essentially 6 main characters voiced by 4 VAs. 2 of them are very notoriously hard to get, so you have all these people around the country trying to fight for the very, very limited pool of guests. And that becomes a little bit tricky. So let me show them out. This is where BronyCon formed. And within a year of BronyCon forming, you start seeing a bunch of PonyCons happening around the country to the point they start to like fill the entire map. So in these early days of PonyCons, you had more PonyCons happening in North America than Doctor Who Con, Twilight Cons, Harry Potter Cons, or Star Trek Cons happening around the world, which is crazy. So all these cons are fighting for very, very few voice actors, and this causes a lot of problems. And let me summarize, because this actually, most people might not recognize it, also had reverberations for the larger convention scene. So let's move into something called Las Vegas' Unicon. So by the groans, I'm guessing people already know what this is, but if you don't know, think DashCon, think TanaCon, think Fire Festival. This is essentially it. So Las Vegas' Unicon tried to pull a big group of actors as their guests of honor. They had John Delancey, who was Q, but also Discord and MLP. You had Lauren Faust, the creator. You had a bunch of VAs. Issue was a lot of the actors all of a sudden had like some of their autograph money being stolen. Sponsors for the cons who spent thousands to get these fancy hotel rooms were now being kicked out of hotel rooms because the con couldn't pay them. You had dealers who couldn't even handle actual money, forced to use this fake like money, and this caused a lot of problem. And the Brony fandom could have quickly died because, remember, technically it's copyrighted IP, and if Hasbro at any moment says you can't do it, the entire fandom and convention scene dies. That's the reason you don't see that many Harry Potter cons, because J.K. Rowling and Warner Brothers are very, very litigious with that stuff. So this is weird because this is a period where the Brony fandom was kind of infighting with each other. You had a lot of people in groups trying to be the Uncle Kage, the Brony fandom. They're all fighting with each other. And all of a sudden, they had to put the differences aside, do a fundraiser. Actually, it was through a lot of Star Trek actors because they shared a lot of the same agents who helped with the fundraisers, and they raised money, kind of saved this con, and it's like, okay, let's calm down and let's reform and reorganize again. We can't have a situation. So they created a new group called VIPR Department. And what's interesting is not only after Unicon did the Brony community had to kind of reorganize, anime cons, comic cons, furry cons saw everything that was happening, and they also had to reform. So this is where Bronies introduced a new department that conventions now use. They call it VIPR, sometimes it's shortened as Viper, sometimes it's called Guest Relations, sometimes it's called the Green Room Department, but it's essentially a guest wellness department to make sure guests are not overworked or stressed out. And after the Brony con started to do that, almost every other con started to adopt this model. So let's talk about how most cons would do it. Now, if you go to a science fiction con or a furry con, you'll normally have one industry guest of honor and one fan guest of honor, and that was it. The Comic Cons and anime cons really ruined this by trying to have contests of who could fill up the con books with as much guest of honor as possible. At that point, you basically are treating your guests as a commodity. They are no longer having fun at your con, and essentially, a lot of old school convention people call these cattle cons because you're essentially shoving all your attendees through lines to get autograph, lines to get pictures, lines to which panels, so it's not really fun. And if an anime VA is having a bad time and doesn't want to come to next year, well, too bad. We have hundreds and thousands of anime VAs or comic book artists who want to come to our cons. Again, the Bronies did not have this option because it had such a small pool of VAs to pull from. So they made the VIPR as a way to kind of help make sure you're not overworked. If they were overworked, make sure they would take breaks, or maybe they'll skip this panel or skip this signing. And so the BronyCons started to also, what's unique about the BronyCons is a majority of BronyCons were founded by trans women or were chaired by trans women. So this is where you get a lot of trans individuals and trans identity issues kind of focused on the cons. So you start seeing really the first en masse scale BronyCons being the first to adopt gender-neutral bathrooms, that has since been picked up by a lot of other cons, the BronyCons were also really the first en masse to use the colored communication tags. I remember when people were saying, oh, cool, MFF is doing these communication tags. Like, well, the BronyCons were doing it at least 5 years beforehand. And like I said, it's because the Bronies are heavily a trans-oriented community. So a lot of people say, oh, Bronies are full of crazy, like, Nazis. Yeah, that's like the 4chaners. You go to furry BronyCons, it's essentially like a trans party. So how did a lot of these Brony elements make their way to the furry cons? Well, of course, people say, oh, Bronies are a subsection of furries, of course, it makes their way. But you also had this group called Cutie Corral. They made these kind of ugly felt plushies. And they wanted to find more groups to run. They wanted to form more cons to run, so they formed a group called Corgi Events and started to make their own pony cons, right? And then they realized, hey, we can make more money making fursuits, so they rebranded as Lemon Brat and started to make a lot of their own furry cons, like Denfur or Quadifur, painted as a fur con. They even bought up an anime con for a period, and of course you probably all heard the story of how Corgi Events kind of imploded. But during that implosion, a lot of the Brony elements moved their way to the furry scene. This is where we get the Brony style of concerts, influencing how furries are now doing concerts. In fact, you go to most furry concerts now, they're mainly staffed by Brony AV team. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to quickly try to go through a lot of these next parts. This is where we get the issue of, like I said, the corporate cons versus fan-run cons. I can just skip past these parts, but this is also where we get a lot of replacement cons. So every time a con starts to now have an issue and collapse, you start quickly have a replacement con. So after Rainforest, you have Anthro Northwest kind of come about. After Rocky Mountain Fur Con, Denver kind of jumped into space. And like I said, this is a period where we had like the Sad Puppies, which were kind of a conservative block building within the Hugo Awards to try to get more conservative authors elected. And also this is where we get the issue of a lot of fascist elements, which we don't realize emerging. Science fiction and fantasy, a lot of fascist elements are in there. Anime cons, sadly, anime is technically started as Axis propaganda, so it makes sense. You have a lot of people dressed as Nazis and Hetalia cosplays at anime cons, which kind of is problematic as well. Superheroes, even though a lot of superheroes were started by Jewish creators, have also been incorporated as the Ubermensch male power fantasy. And of course, Bronies and furries had to deal with that element in their communities as well, so there was a lot of weeding out. The Bronies and furries, I think, were kind of the best at weeding it out, but it's kind of been a problem at a lot of other cons as well. So speaking of Bronies, coincidentally in 2019 was the final BronyCon. Coincidentally, that was also the last season of My Little Pony, so you had a lot of Bronies start migrating to the furry scene. But coincidentally, that year was also the 80th Worldcon and 50th San Diego Comic-Con. So this is where I was originally going to end the book. I thought it was a perfect year to end it. And then something happened called a pandemic, But, so a lot of the Bronies made their way. So a lot of people who are kind of big now were former Bronies, and they made their way off to other stuff. Speaking of Bronies, so a lot of people joke Bronies are just a subsection of furries. Well, if that's the case, then that would mean BronyCon was the first furry con to break 10,000 attendees. And if that's also the case, that would mean BronyCon is the second largest furry con of all time. So, checkmate their furries. Do you want Bronies to be considered furries or not? But it's interesting. I actually find it interesting that, like the Trekkies, the Bronies, like the Trekkies, overwhelmed their dominant science fiction con scene brethren. The Bronies also overwhelmed the overall furry con scene. So you had the BronyCon right here, basically for almost 3 years, being the largest anthropomorphic specific convention until MFF finally surpassed it. But it was really only after BronyCon ended did the furry cons kind of keep that lead. But just to compare, these are all the furry and BronyCons, and then right there, that's I think that's where I put BronyCon right there is with the other pony conventions. But all the Brony and furry cons are nothing compared to the anime and the comic cons. But even the biggest anime cons and comic cons in America are nothing compared to Comic Cats in Japan. So, I mean, it's just scales and scales and scales of how big each of these things are for each other. So, like I said, the pandemic happened. That changed things. The Bronies at this point were the most tech savvy of cons. Bronies are very used to doing online cons, so it was natural that the Bronies were kind of the first to make the first online cons during the pandemic. And this is where we get Ponyfest Online, which emerged from a Discord server. And essentially, they would do a lot of fun stuff. They would host concerts and panels within Zoom and Second Life. They would later partner with a group called Ponytown, where you can make your own little pony avatar and interact, and it will screen a lot of the panels in Pony Avatar. Then you had a Southeast Pony Convention online, basically recreate a convention center in Minecraft, and you could go to these little Minecraft rooms and watch panels and stuff. And of course, the furries were like, okay, we could do one better. And then the furries started to recreate entire convention centers in VR chat, and then took the ropes for the next season. And while the furry cons and brony cons online were really flourishing, you saw the anime and comic cons and sci-fi cons not doing so well online. So this shows how well bronies and furries really run their conventions in comparison. But there was a bunch of different online cons during this period that also had a lot of fun. Consolation was a con where basically it was just a Facebook group where people post cat memes. So
over here, because we're in, Fernal Equinox is in March.
Mhm.
Fernal Equinox got canceled on the Friday before the con. The replacement con which was called Keep Calm and Carry Con was organized in a week.
Okay, that
Put
makes
together
sense.
in a single week.
Yeah, actually I remember because the TFF was the very last con that that took place right before the pandemic. I remember because that's when I actually finally made my down payment for Bash. You might see around later tonight. And then I was like, oh, I probably should have kept that money during the pandemic, but I'm glad I have my fursuit now. But a lot of fun stuff. So, like we said, a lot of, even now that cons are back in person, there's still the VR element still incorporated with a lot of these cons. And since my panel is the next one after, I'm going to kind of, if you want to stay around for questions, I will kind of allow people to stay around for questions since my panel is right after. But I want to kind of finish by showcasing. So yeah, basically I have the furries right there in brown and orange, but we could see this entire family tree of how all these cons have kind of came from a similar source and innovated and interacted with each other. No con was unique, no con superseded the other, but each of them had their own unique element. And with that, I want to finish with, let's see if I can bring it up here. I'm going to finish with, since I was originally going to end the final chapter with the final BronyCon, I thought a good way to end this panel to showcase 80-year convention history was to play a recording of the final BronyCon concert that I went to. So this is just a small clip of it. I'm not going to show the full one, but this is what happened. You have to remember, this all evolved from folk music. So someone just randomly strumming a guitar in an empty panel room evolved into this. My flag's there. this was made by a trans female droning musician as well. So. I think with that, that concludes an 80-year history of conventions. Thank you very much for coming to the panel. Be sure to stick around in half an hour. I'll be doing my history of shapeshifters and transformation. So if you like werewolves and stuff, feel free for that. If not, you're free to go. And if you want to ask questions, raise your hand. I'll take as much questions as I can. Thank you. Any questions? No? Right. And also, the flyers are up here with the low mini version of the timeline if you want to grab one.
I remember somebody collecting me in the middle of all